The Implosion of Sweetness, Boston, January 15th, 1919. Hushness, and imagine a sound you could never conceive. A sound that was the last thing 21 people on the Boston waterfront ever heard. It was not a crack of ice, nor the screech of a brake, nor the steam whistle of a ship calling port. It was, rather, a monstrous, basso profundo groan, a sound of tearing, wrenching metal, immediately followed by an explosion of air so vast and violent it had the terrifying immediacy of a shell blast. This was the prelude to the Great Molasses Flood, a disaster so bizarre, so unprecedented, and so darkly comic in its central agent, a torrent of sugar syrup, that it has since been relegated to the footnotes of history. A strange anecdote alongside the influenza pandemic and the Great War's end. Yet for the people of Boston's North End in the first moments of January 15, 1919, this was not a novelty. It was death. It was the end of a world. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA tank, an imposing, riveted steel cylinder, 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, a structure of almost malevolent presence on Commercial Street, was the villain of the piece. It squatted just feet from the water's edge, holding a stupendous 2.3 million gallons of crude, dark molasses. Molasses which was not destined for Grandma's holiday baking, but for the Purity Distilling Company's plant in Cambridge, where it would be fermented into industrial alcohol. This alcohol, crucial during the war, now stood to be a huge peacetime profit, essential for munitions, and soon illegal rum. It was an unseasonably warm day for a New England January. The temperature had surged from a freezing 2 degrees Fahrenheit just 2 days prior to a balmy 43 degrees. This thermal spike, scientists would later prove, was a critical factor. Inside the monolithic tank, the molasses, freshly delivered from the Caribbean warmth, was not simply resting, it was fermenting. As the temperature rose, the dormant yeasts awoke, gorging on the sugar and releasing an enormous, invisible pressure of carbon dioxide gas, a ticking time bomb of delicious, sticky sweetness. The tank was a known hazard. Built in a hurry in 1915, its structural integrity was, in a word, negligible. Arthur Gell, the USIA treasurer who supervised its construction, was no engineer. He had skipped vital safety checks, and the steel plates were too thin, the rivets too few and too weak. For years, the North End locals, predominantly Italian immigrants living in cramped tenements, had seen the evidence of this shoddy workmanship. The tank leaked. Dark brown, viscous streams oozed from its seams, leading children to collect the sweet runoff in jars and neighbors to complain of a sickeningly sweet odor, a complaint that USIA had solved not by reinforcing the structure, but merely painting it a matching shade of brown to conceal the leaks. They had dressed a gaping wound with a coat of paint. At 12:30 p.m., the world tilted on its axis. The explosion, for it was nothing less, was not from a bomb, as USIA would later frantically claim. It was an implosion of the tank's bottom, an absolute failure of its underdesigned structure to withstand the internal pressure. The sound was a thunderclap heard for blocks, the boom of metal tearing apart at the seams. Witnesses said the heavy steel rivets, some a half-inch thick, shot out like shrapnel, slicing through the air. And then the wave. 2.5 million gallons of dense, industrial-grade molasses, a liquid significantly heavier than water, were unleashed in a cataclysmic black-brown tsunami. The wave was estimated to be between 15 and 40 feet high, its cresting foam of sweet syrup reaching the roof lines of 3-story buildings. It was not a flow. It was a charge, moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour. For context, a person running their fastest would be easily outpaced by this sugary deluge. The immediate impact was one of impossible, overwhelming force. The wave slammed into the adjacent Boston Elevated Railway structure, a mammoth lattice of steel, and knocked one of its trains right off its tracks. It annihilated the nearby North End Paving Department and police station, crushing its wooden structure to splinters. Most tragically, it crumpled Firehouse 31, a building full of firemen eating their lunch, pushing the heavy structure clean off its foundations and penning the men beneath the wreckage in the basement. The human toll began instantly. It was not drowning in the traditional sense, but suffocation and crushing by an element that was both liquid and dense as concrete. One moment, Antonio D'Estasio, a streetcar conductor, was walking home. The next, he was swept up in a fast-moving, treacly current that plastered him against a building. Christina Pantano was sitting at her kitchen table. The waves swept the entire tenement building away, burying her. The wave did not simply move matter, it carried it. It was a slurry of devastation, molasses, bricks, beams, cobblestones, and the tangled, dying forms of men and horses. The cry of the victims, a desperate gurgling as the thick, sticky substance filled their mouths and lungs, was a sound of absolute horror. Horses, pulling wagons for the paving department, were instantly smothered, killed like so many flies on sticky flypaper, according to one newspaper account. They died standing upright, entombed in a syrupy 2-foot-thick layer. Within 5 minutes, the roar died to a sinister, burbling silence. The wave had spent its initial terrifying force, but the danger had not passed. The warm molasses, meeting the cold January air, began to cool and thicken rapidly, transforming from a deadly wave into a deadly, gelatinous glue. The rescue effort was immediate and surreal. Rescuers arrived to find a devastated landscape, utterly unrecognizable. Commercial Street was now a dark, sticky river. Debris was everywhere, and in the black-brown ooze there were bodies, some mangled, some simply submerged, their thrashing movements slowed to a desperate, agonizing crawl by the viscous density of the syrup. It was almost impossible to move through. Every step was a sucking effort, a fight against the adhesive substance that trapped men's boots and pulled the hair from their scalps. The first heroes on the scene were over 100 young sailors from the nearby USS Nantucket, a training ship docked at the pier. These men, many of them teenagers, waded into the mess, trying to pry survivors from the death grip of the syrup. They discovered the cruel irony of the disaster. The syrup was too sticky to allow them to effectively pull people free. A rope pulled too hard might simply tear a body apart. To pull a man from the clinging fluid was like trying to lift a boulder from quicksand. They worked with agonizing slowness. One rescuer recalled using a shovel not to dig, but to pry a survivor free from the hardening goo. Another worked desperately to free an elderly woman, only to realize too late that she had died of shock and cold, encased in a sugary coffin. The tragedy of the Molasses Flood, which ultimately claimed 21 lives and injured over 150, was not just the force of the initial blast, but the agonizing slowness of the aftermath. It took hours, then days, to locate and retrieve the deceased. Some bodies were swept into Boston Harbor, recovered days later, swollen and coated in the dark syrup. The very air was heavy, sweet, and cloying. And this, for the city of Boston, was only the very beginning of the long, strange, and legally complex reckoning that would follow.
Of the hour of the sticky tsunami, personal destinies. The wave, a massive, dense fist of syrup and fury, was a force of nature, or rather a catastrophic demonstration of man's greed and neglect masquerading as a natural disaster. But the victims weren't statistics. They were the beating heart of Boston's North End, a vibrant, densely packed immigrant community of Italians, Irish, and Jews, all living, working, and raising families within yards of USIA's chemical behemoth. The terror was over in the length of time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. Yet in those few minutes, dozens of personal destinies were instantly, violently rewritten. Take Pasquale Antosca, a father of two who was inside the North End paving department barn. The wave did not so much hit the building as it vaporized it. The molasses, heavy as oil, had struck the barn with the percussive force of a runaway locomotive. Pasquale was buried instantly, not beneath syrup, but beneath the lumber and concrete that the syrup had carried. His final resting place, an unrecognizable heap of wood and stone saturated in the deathly goo. Just outside, in the street, was Maria Di Stasio. The Di Stasio family, Antonio, his wife Maria, and their young son Tony, were a fixture of the neighborhood. Maria was on her way to a fish market, a simple midday errand when the tank ruptured. The noise, the shock, the sheer unimaginable blackness of the wave, it was all too much. She was swept away, hurled against the sharp edges of debris. When rescuers, covered head to toe in the sticky fluid, finally found her hours later, she had succumbed not to drowning, but to the crushing weight of the molasses and the injuries from the rubble it carried. Her husband, Antonio, whose narrow escape you already know, would spend the rest of his life haunted by the fact that he was feet away when his wife was taken by a river of sugar. The saddest and most symbolic victims were often found at Engine 31, the firehouse closest to the tank. It was lunch hour. The firemen, or fire laddies as they were affectionately known, had just sat down for a rare moment of midday peace. Lieutenant George Leahy was there, a respected officer, along with Patrick Breen and Niels Kjellman. They were professionals, men trained to run into danger. But this danger was silent, swift, and utterly alien. The waves slammed into the firehouse, shoving the massive two-story brick and stone structure 4 to 6 inches off its foundation. The ground floor buckled, and the men were plunged into the basement where the molasses followed, thick and unrelenting. Trapped, crushed by timbers, and slowly suffocated, they died while surrounded by the tools of rescue they could not deploy. Leahy's body was recovered days later, identifiable only by the heavy gold wedding band still on his finger. The sacrifice of Engine 31's crew underscored the sheer impossibility of surviving the physics of the wave, a force that to displace a brick building was not something human lungs could resist. The viscosity of death, a physical hell. The Molasses Flood was not merely a tragic accident, it was a unique and horrific physics experiment. Understanding the nature of the molasses is key to understanding why the disaster was so deadly and why the cleanup was a nightmare. This was not the delicate golden table molasses one might pour on pancakes. This was crude industrial molasses, the unrefined byproduct of sugar processing shipped from the sugarcane fields of Cuba and the Caribbean. It was heavy, nearly 12 pounds per gallon, and incredibly dense. At room temperature, molasses is sluggish. At 43 degrees Fahrenheit, it was still moving fast, but as it spread across the colder ground and mixed with the icy harbor air, its physical properties changed dramatically. The science behind the tragedy is twofold. The initial velocity, the force of the rupture combined with the weight of 2.3 million gallons, propelled the liquid mass at over 30 miles per hour. This speed, combined with its density, it was 1.4 times heavier than water, gave it a massive amount of kinetic energy, allowing it to destroy steel train tracks and brick buildings. It was a battering ram of sugar. The rapid thickening. Once the wave slowed, the cold air and ground rapidly sucked the heat from the molasses. As it cooled, it became non-Newtonian in its lethality. It changed from a flowing liquid to a semi-solid gel. This sticky, unforgiving mass solidified in the 2 to 3 foot deep layer it covered the north end with, trapping anyone caught in it like insects in amber. The cleanup crews, made up of city workers, engineers, and hundreds of sailors, faced this physical hell. They tried hoses, but the sheer volume and adhesive quality of the molasses turned high-pressure water into an ineffective spatter. They tried to shovel it, but the shovels simply stuck. One account describes a man dropping a brick onto the molasses and watching it not sink, but bounce like rubber off the sticky surface. The solution came from the sea. Fireboats were summoned to the scene, their pumps drawing seawater from the harbor. Crews saturated the molasses with salt water and then covered the entire mess with layers of sand, hoping to absorb the viscous fluid. This process had to be repeated dozens of times, an exhaustive, disgusting effort that took weeks. Even then, the molasses was so pervasive it had seeped into the soil, down into the sewers, and onto the pilings of the wharves. For months, the North End was a monument to the surreal disaster. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage, one Boston Post reporter wrote the next day. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. The smell was the longest-lasting memory. The distinct, sickly sweet, fermenting odor of molasses clung to the neighborhood for years. Every time the temperature rose in the summer, the ground would warm and the scent would rise again from the streets, the basements, and the harbor mud, an olfactory ghost of the dead. The immediate aftermath, the search for a scapegoat.
As the city grieved and the massive unsanitary cleanup began, the owners of the tank, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, were already executing their strategy, complete and total denial of responsibility. USIA was a massive, powerful corporation, and they were keenly aware of the massive financial implications of the tragedy. They could not afford to be seen as negligent. The company's vice president, Arthur Gell, the same man who oversaw the tank's quick and cheap construction, immediately put forth a baseless yet politically astute theory. The disaster was the work of anarchist terrorists. The timing of the flood played directly into this cynical deflection. America in January 1919 was on edge. World War I had ended just months before, ushering in the Red Scare. Anarchist and labor agitator sentiment was high, fueled by mass immigration and post-war tension. The North End, being heavily Italian, was easily linked in the minds of the Boston elite and establishment press to these radical elements. USIA lawyers shamelessly propagated the story that a bomb had been planted by an evilly disposed person or a German spy, targeting the industrial alcohol used for munitions. This allowed them to paint the victims not as casualties of corporate malfeasance, but as martyrs in a secret war, and USIA as an innocent patriotic target. This narrative, while factually absurd, no evidence of a bomb was ever found, and the structural failure was obvious to any trained eye, worked in the short term. It exploited the xenophobia and fear of the time, muddying the waters and turning public opinion, or at least public doubt, away from the company's glaringly obvious negligence. But the families of the dead, backed by a few brave lawyers, refused to let the lie stand. The victims and property owners soon banded together, realizing they faced an unprecedented battle against one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the nation. They filed a massive class action lawsuit against USIA, initiating a legal battle that would last for 6 grueling years, reshape American law, and force the public to confront the true meaning of corporate accountability. The fight for justice was about to begin, and it would be as protracted, sticky, and exhausting as the cleanup of the molasses itself.
The longest case, 6 years in the shadow of the sweet smell. The immediate human cost of the Great Molasses Flood was terrible. 21 dead, 150 injured, and hundreds homeless. But the indirect cost, the fight for justice and accountability, was just beginning. This was the era of the powerful, unchecked corporation, where industrial accidents were often dismissed as simple occupational hazards. The legal battle that followed was not just about damages, it was a brutal 6-year war to define corporate responsibility in the modern industrial age. The $300,000 class action suit, equivalent to over $5 million today, was brought by the survivors and the families of the deceased against USIA, represented by the towering legal firm of Bartlett and Bartlett. They knew they faced a daunting task. They had to prove not that the tank broke, that was self-evident, but that USIA was negligent and that the company knew the risk it was inflicting on a civilian population. The audacity of the defense, blaming anarchists. USIA's defense team, spearheaded by the slick, aggressive tactics of the day, stuck firmly to the anarchist bomb narrative. Their opening arguments painted USIA as the victim of a malicious, un-American act of sabotage. This tactic was brilliantly chosen to play on the fears of the 1919 Boston establishment. They argued that the explosive force that twisted the heavy steel girders of the elevated railway could only have come from a high-powered explosive, not the slow, internal pressure of fermentation. They were attempting to weaponize xenophobia. By implying that the catastrophe was the fault of evilly disposed persons, they sought to align themselves with American patriotism and cast a shadow of suspicion over the working-class, immigrant community who made up most of the plaintiffs. The search for truth. Enter Hugh Ogden. Faced with a disaster that defied ordinary explanation and a defense rooted in political fear-mongering, the Massachusetts courts took an extraordinary step. They appointed a single, unbiased auditor to investigate the facts, take testimony, and issue a finding. That man was Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, a distinguished lawyer and veteran. Ogden's task was Herculean. He had to separate engineering fact from corporate fiction. For 4 long years, from 1920 to 1924, Ogden conducted nearly 1,000 interviews and heard testimony from nearly 3,000 witnesses. His chambers became a bizarre nexus of structural physics, fermentation biology, and human trauma. The testimony was a parade of specialists, metallurgists who examined the twisted wreckage of the tank, engineers who studied its flawed design, and microbiologists who testified to the vigorous gas-producing life of yeast within the tank's walls. Crucially, Ogden heard from Arthur Gell, the USIA manager who oversaw the construction. Gell admitted under oath to his shocking lack of qualifications. He was a treasurer, not an engineer. He'd skipped the essential and basic safety test of filling the tank with water, a test that would have revealed the tank's fatal structural flaws immediately, months before it burst. When Gell was confronted with the complaints from locals about the molasses leaking from the seams, his only defense was the infamous anecdote, "We told them they would have to learn to get used to the smell." The scientific showdown. Fermentation versus dynamite. Ogden's investigation ultimately hinged on the battle between 2 sets of expert witnesses, those who testified for the bomb theory and those who testified for the fermentation and poor construction theory. The scientific consensus that emerged was damning to USIA. The metallurgical analysis revealed that the steel was brittle and the rivet seams were far too thin for the tank's immense contents. The weight of 2.3 million gallons of molasses was approximately 13,000 tons, an incredible pressure that the cheap tank was never designed to hold. More critically, the scientists proved that the fermentation pressure was enough to trigger the collapse. The sharp spike in temperature the day of the disaster had supercharged the yeast activity. The internal pressure, combined with the structural flaws and the rapid filling of the tank with a fresh shipment of molasses, created a pressure cooker. The tank didn't explode outward like a bomb. It failed at its weakest point and split. When it failed, the molasses, due to its viscosity and mass, created a massive vacuum and a shock wave of displaced air, giving it the initial sonic effect of an explosion, but without the chemical residue or heat of dynamite. The speed and force came from the colossal weight of the fluid, not from a fuse. The anarchist theory was dismantled, scientifically and logically. The verdict and the legacy. In 1925, after 6 agonizing years, Colonel Ogden delivered his final ruling. His verdict was unequivocal. USIA was held liable. He found that the tank was structurally unsound, insufficiently tested, and that its fatal defects should have been known to the company. The Molasses Flood was not an act of God or a political assassination. It was a disaster caused by corporate negligence. The company was ordered to pay a final settlement of approximately $600,000, or about $10 million today, to the victims and the injured parties. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. No amount of money could truly compensate for the lives lost or the years of trauma and cleanup. The lasting impact of the Great Molasses Flood far transcended the financial settlement. The case set a powerful legal precedent in American law. For the first time, an industrial corporation was held fully accountable for a disaster on the basis of negligence, rather than being absolved by blaming external forces or simply paying workers' compensation. The disaster led directly to profound changes in safety and construction standards, particularly in Massachusetts. Building permits and construction drawings were now required to be reviewed by certified independent civil engineers. The assumption that a company could build what it wanted, where it wanted, without inspection, was over. The Molasses Flood forced the city of Boston, and eventually the nation, to admit that industrial safety was not an optional luxury, but a mandatory protection for the public. It was the moment Americans realized that a company's rush for profit could quite literally drown the innocent in a wave of sticky, sweet, deadly neglect. The disaster faded from memory over time, but the legal framework it forged endures, a quiet, crucial safeguard underpinning every construction project across the United States, all thanks to a wave of sugar that ran through the streets of Boston in 1919.